This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nitahone, and today's Monday, so that means it's time for another MTG Top 10, the series where I rank cards based on their historical performance and Magic's highest level of competition. At least that's normally what I do in this series. Sometimes I look at topics that are a little more complicated than that, and that's what we'll be doing today with a look at good cards that have appeared in bad cycles. In Magic, a cycle is a collection of cards that are related to one another due to their effects or themes. The most common type of cycle is one where each color receives a card. On planes with multicolored factions, we often see cycles of multicolored cards representing each of those factions. Cycles have been around since the very beginning, with several included in Alpha. The 5 basic lands are technically a cycle, and if we set that one aside, the Boon cycle is likely the most prominent of the cycles that appeared in Alpha. The cards in this cycle all cost 1 mana and then do something color appropriate that involves the number 3, and here we have some of the most powerful cards in the game, like Ancestral Recall, Dark Ritual, and of course, Healing Salve. This actually isn't the first time when I've done an MTG Top 10 on cycles. In the past, I did one on the worst cycles of cards, and that list was entirely made up of cycles where not a single card saw play at Magic's highest level of competition, or really, EDH. What I'm doing this time around is a little bit different because these cycles all have one card in them that's really good, and the other 4 aren't so good. This video is based on my own opinion, but I did use data to help me make my selections. A card could only appear on this list if there was a massive gap in performance between it and the other cards in the cycle. For the most part, this generally means that the card we're looking at was highly successful at Magic's highest level of competition, while the other cards in the cycle weren't at all. The other cards in the cycle also have to not see widespread play in EDH. Most of the cards you'll see on this list are actually quite prominent, and they're so much better than the other cards in their cycle that you may not even know that they're part of a cycle. Another important thing, I didn't look at cycles of sets that are still in Standard since I don't think we can judge those cycles fairly just yet. Alright, let's jump into the list. At number 10, I have Enduring Ideal. It's part of a cycle of rares with the Epic mechanic in Saviors of Kamigawa. The Epic mechanic makes it so that, for the rest of the game, the spell gets cast at the beginning of your upkeep. That seems pretty sweet, but there's one big downside. You can't cast any other spells for the remainder of the game. Obviously, that's a pretty big problem, but Enduring Ideal actually gives you enough value to overcome that downside, as it allows you to tutor up an enchantment and put it into play every turn, and you can use it to amass an enchantment-based combo or to build up a bunch of prison effects that make your opponent's life difficult. The other 4 cards in the cycle don't come close to giving you that kind of value, at least not for the mana cost. Endless Swarm just gives you 1/1s that aren't imposing at all. Eternal Dominion actually has a really powerful effect, but 10 mana is an insane amount. Never-Ending Torment lets you slowly rip your opponent's library apart, but the keyword there is slow, and since you're not casting anything else, you're probably dying to whatever's on the board. And Undying Flames just does damage to stuff, which is also probably going to be too slow. Enduring Ideal actually spawned an entire deck archetype in both Standard and Extended, and it is also played in EDH more than the rest of the cards in this cycle. At number 9, it's Thopter Foundry, which is part of the iconic Thopter Foundry Sword of the Meek combo. With both in play, you can use the ability as many times per turn as you have mana and quickly overwhelm your opponent. It's part of an Alara Reborn cycle of 3-color uncommons for each of the shards that have both monocolored and hybrid-colored mana in their cost. Thopter Foundry's combo potential has been a big deal in multiple formats, and the other 4 cards in this cycle have never seen play in competitive Magic. 3 of them are just mediocre creatures, and the other is a threaten effect. Slave of Bolas does see some pretty decent play in EDH, and that's part of why the Foundry's at number 9 instead of higher on the list, because that does close the gap between Thopter Foundry and the rest of the cycle a little bit, but Thopter Foundry is still way better than everything else in this cycle. At number 8, it's Avatar of Woe. It's part of a cycle of avatars from Prophecy. Each avatar is expensive, but they all come with a cost reduction effect that makes them incredibly cheap and imposing. Avatar of Woe is way better than its fellow avatars though for 3 reasons. First, it's simply the most powerful of the bunch in a vacuum. It's large and hard to block, and importantly, it can tap to kill creatures. Second, it has a more obtainable cost reduction effect. especially for black self-mill decks, and third, it's black, and that means it can easily slide into reanimator decks, and it's a pretty scary thing to reanimate. The other avatars look pretty terrible next to it. Avatar of Hope is a big defensive creature that only gets cheaper when you're already almost dead. Avatar of Might is just a big trampler that only has its cost reduced when your opponent is way ahead of you on board, so playing it at that point doesn't matter. Avatar of Will is a medium-sized flyer that only gets cheap when your opponent is out of cards, and Avatar of Fury is a large, fire-breathing flyer that only has its cost reduced in the extreme late game. Avatar of Woe is miles better than these, and that's reflected in how much it's been played in EDH and the success it's found in competitive Magic. At number 7, it's Nettle Sentinel. It's part of a cycle of common creatures in Eventide that untap when you play a spell of that card's color. The other cards in the cycle all have some type of effect they can use when they tap, but the effects they have mostly aren't that exciting, especially when you consider how inefficient they are as creatures. Meanwhile, Nettle Sentinel is a very impressive 1-mana 2/2. Now, in a vacuum, the Sentinel wouldn't be great, but it has been a great 1-drop for elf decks that play stuff every turn and also have payoffs for the elf creature type. At its most busted, the Sentinel can be combined with Glimpse of Nature and effects that let your elves tap for mana. If you can pull that off, you draw your entire deck in most cases and kill your opponent because the Sentinel keeps untapping and producing more mana. Meanwhile, the other cards in this cycle don't have a single top 8 to their name. Cinder Pyromancer is the best of the bunch and does see some play in EDH, but overall, they're just too inefficient and do too little even when they really go off. At number 6, I've got Wild Nacatl. The Nacatl is famous for being a 1-mana 3/3 that Naya aggro decks love, but did you know it's actually part of a cycle of common 1-mana 1/1s and Shards of Alara? It's pretty crazy just how much better Wild Nacatl is than the other cards in the list. Across Squire and Death Greeter have a bit of potential, but the other cards are just terrible. They are 1-mana 1/1s with super limited upside, which is pretty funny when you line them up against the Nacatl. Death Greeter sees a bit of play in EDH, but I think the gap between the Nacatl and the other cards in Constructed is still enough to overcome that. At number 5, I've got Oath of Druids. I recently did a deck history video on decks that were constructed to abuse this card, so if you want to hear me talk about it for like 20 minutes, check that out, but suffice it to say, Oath of Druid decks have been a thing for over 2 decades. The Oath itself is part of a cycle of Oath enchantments in Exodus. All of them have symmetrical upkeep triggers that give a player some effect if their opponent has more of something. Oath of Ghouls looks at creature cards in graveyards, Oath of Lieges looks at lands in play, Oath of Mages looks at life, and Oath of Scholars looks at cards in hand. Meanwhile, Oath of Druids looks at creatures in play and arguably also gives you the most powerful payoff. You get to put a creature from your deck into play. And sure, you don't have complete control over what you hit, except that you kind of do if you build a deck where the only creature is Gristlebrand, and that's what Oath of Druids decks tend to do. And it's not that hard to get it to trigger, you just have to not play creatures. That's pretty simple, especially because you can find ways to give your opponent creatures and thus make it trigger. So yeah, a turn 2 Gristlebrand is pretty scary. Oath of Ghouls does have one Pro Tour top 8 from the late 90s, but that's basically nothing compared to Oath of Druid's track record. If we look at EDH, Oath of Lieges is actually played close to the same amount as Oath of Druids, and while that keeps Oath out of being higher on this list, the gap between Oath of Druids and the other cards in the cycle is absolutely massive. At number 4, it's Cranial Plating. The plating is one of the best equipments we've ever seen and is particularly potent in artifact-based aggro decks. In particular, it's been a key player in affinity decks in multiple formats. If you slap this on an Ornithopter or a Vault Scourge, it does massive amounts of damage in a hurry. It's part of a cycle of common equipment in 5th Dawn, all of which cost 2 to play, 1 to equip, and can be moved at instant speed for 2 colored mana. There's a good chance you don't even know that these other cards exist. The boosts offered by the other equipment in this cycle are pretty anemic by comparison, though Nurok's Stealth Suit does get interesting in situations where you can move it at instant speed, and it is kind of a legit card in EDH, where it can be used to protect your commander, but that's still not enough to save the cycle from being a pretty terrible one collectively without Cranial Plating in it. While Cranial Plating was a staple in an iconic multi-format deck, the other 4 cards in this cycle have 0 top 8s. At number 3, it's Saikatog. It's part of a cycle of 2-colored Atogs from Odyssey. They all have 2 abilities that let you pump their power and toughness. Saikatog is well known as one of Standard and Extended's most feared control deck win conditions in the early 2000s. Turning both your hand and graveyard into stats boosts for the Saikatog can turn into lethal in a hurry, especially in a deck that draws and discards a lot of cards. The card types of the cards that pump up Saikatog don't matter at all, and that's what makes it better than its cycle mates. The other cards in the cycle ask for significantly more specific things to happen to pump their stats. Fantatog needs enchantments, Sarkatog needs artifacts, Lithatog needs artifacts and lands, and Thaumatog needs lands and enchantments. None of them are very good in EDH, even Saikatog, but Saikatog is the most played there by a pretty wide margin too. At number 2, it's Wild Mongrel, the second consecutive card from Odyssey. The Mongrel is part of a cycle of common 2-mana 2/2 dogs from Odyssey. This dog has huge upside in its ability to pump its stats when you discard cards. This was particularly powerful when combined with mechanics like Threshold and Madness, since then discarding cards was actually a good thing, and made Wild Mongrel a pretty heavily played card in both Standard and Extended. The other cards in this cycle are much worse. Filthy Cur, Mad Dog, and Phantom Whelp are just terrible cards. They're all 2-mana 2/2s with big downsides. Patrol Hound can at least gain first strike by discarding a card, which makes it reasonable, but it still pales in comparison to the Mongrel. This is true in both constructed competitive formats and EDH. And at number 1, it's Rancor, which was part of a cycle of recurring auras from Urza's Destiny. Rancor is one of the best auras ever printed in that it gives a great stats boost and trample for only a single mana, and it comes back to your hand when it goes to the graveyard from play. That recursion helps overcome the risk of getting 2-for-1 that comes with most auras. And the other auras in this cycle also have that upside, but they aren't good enough for it to matter. They all cost more mana despite being less useful. In fact, Rancor did originally cost 3 in playtesting, but stuff got changed at the last minute to make it into the powerhouse we know today. If you're more interested in that story, I did a top 10 on last minute changes where I go a little deeper on it. But yeah, all but Sleeper's Guile downgrade an opposing creature, but they don't do a very good job of it. Sleeper's Guile does give evasion, but it's pretty hilarious to compare to Rancor, which also gives an evasive keyword and a stats boost for 2 less mana. It has a very impressive resume with a lot of premier level success, and none of the other cards in this cycle really even get out of your bulk commons box. It's also pretty close to a staple in green EDH decks, widening the gap between it and the other cards in this cycle even more. Because Rancor is played so much in Premier formats and EDH, and the other cards in this cycle are so awful, it definitely comes out as the card that is the most better than the other cards in its cycle. So, those are my picks for the 10 best cards that are in bad cycles. If you want to own any of these cards, check out the description where you'll find a direct Card Kingdom link for each of them. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you want to catch up on past videos, you should see some playlists on your screen shortly that will help you do that. And if you want to support the channel, you can on Patreon. Thanks for watching.